must have been 89 or something like that. I had just won the Austrian Young Musicians competition. And then cellist Robert Cohen came to Linz, where I grew up, and we went to the concert, and I went, as you do as a young musician, you go afterwards to see the artist, and I talked to him. And asked if he was teaching anywhere or master classes or something like that. And yes, he said he was. And then I went to a master class with him and had some private lessons in London. And quite soon afterwards, he said, well, you should go and meet my teacher, Bill Pleeth. And of course, I knew who he was because Jacqueline Dupre at that time was still everywhere, and she had just died a couple of years before. So there was still a big name in the scene. And long story short, I ended up playing for Bill, and he said, do you want to be my student? And well, yes, of course, at that time, because that was like meeting the Messiah to a certain extent. And from then on, I spent virtually all school holidays and everything in London. My father was very supportive and generous and made that possible. And it was kind of an adventure because for a 15-year-old, being in London on your own, weeks on end. But Robert was there, and Bill also took care of sort of the psychological aspect of that quite well. And the first years, that was really, and also my teacher in Austria was supportive of it. So he sort of shared me with Bill at the time. And that was therefore a very isolated one-to-one situation because Bill had retired from the Guildhall School, so there was no academic framework around it, and I just had lessons with him for a long time and played all my repertoire for him and all the major cello works over years. Which is probably connected with where he came from. He of course, what people don't know these days because it's pre-internet and there's no book about him really, which is astonishing that nobody's written the biography. He was a wunderkind at the time. He was a child prodigy, and he was born in 1916, so that's quite a long time ago. And he was sent to Leipzig, which was at the time one of the greatest schools for particularly string playing, when he was 13 or 14, so in 1929 or 1930, to study with Julius Klengel, who was one of the three great pedagogues in Germany, of the great cellists. He was friends with Brahms, of course. Klengel was a friend of Brahms. There's a story around that later. And he went to Leipzig and studied with Klengel for, I think, 2 or 3 years, something like that, until Klengel died. And he was to become his last student and claims to have never had any other lesson afterwards, which is possible. And he made his debut in the Gewandhaus in Leipzig when he was 14 with the Dvorak Concerto. And from then on had a quite remarkable career as a soloist until his late 20s, when he decided that's sort of boring to a certain extent, and he that also, of course, the war started. Then there was a thing in England that was called Stars in Battle Dress. He was part of that with Edmund Rabra, the composer, and they formed a trio with Eli Goren. And from then on, he discovered his love for chamber music, really, in his, well, that would have been his late 20s, early 30s. And that was what he did then for a long time. He was the cellist of the Allegri Quartet with Eli Goren. And then, of course, he turned into this teacher legend that was, of course, enhanced by the fame of Jackie Dupre. But there are many, many, many other students that he had. I mean, in every British orchestra of a certain generation, every second cellist was his student for a long time. So he had a really quite multifaceted career, and due to what was documented in the end, he's remembered as a teacher most, but before that there was a lot of playing, which is somehow a little bit forgotten. But if you go in the BBC archive, there's hundreds of recordings, particularly with his wife Maggie Good, and a lot of duo recordings, but also concertos and chamber music and everything. So I was aware of that, but obviously the extent of his own playing career became apparent to me only during the time when I studied with him, and at that time no recordings of his were even available. I've got quite a number of fantastic record, like a very beautiful Haydn concerto from the 40s from the Proms. He was one of the very few artists who had a prom as a soloist for over a decade every year. But of course the BBC also deleted a lot of recordings in the 50s and 60s and overplayed tapes and stuff, so stuff is lost. But anyway, so he turned into this also playing legend in my perception while I studied with him. And therefore, the teaching, of course, was focused on that aspect of playing, of delivering the solo repertoire. That's what he taught me to do. But in a way that was never, it was never instructive. There was something very special about playing for him. I always felt that when I sat in the lesson, I did things that I had never done before. And then when I went back practicing, I thought, like, how the heck did I do that? What happened in that lesson? Why could I do this? He'd never go say, you have to do this and then it's going to work, which is very different to some other teaching that I've received as a student. But with him, that was always the special thing, that you do something and afterwards you're like, how did I do that? Just by him sort of making you search for it, and he'd never give you a fingering. He'd say, that's probably not the best fingering. What others can you come up with? And he'd make you try the weirdest things and then explain why that's even worse or maybe better. And therefore you develop your own sense of what works and what doesn't work. And then at the same time, he therefore still sits on my shoulder when I practice to this day, because he had these sort of golden principles of what's okay to do. Like, you of course, as a string player, there are, particularly when it's fast and somewhere up, and then you can do, for instance, fingerings across the strings, and that's easy and quite likely to be in tune because it's in one position. But sound-wise, it sometimes probably is too easy and not brilliant enough. And he'd have this term instant coffee fingering. And of course that stays with you. I still practice. I got instant coffee fingering. And you have to make a conscious decision against it. Or for it, if you say, right, but I really want to get this in tune on stage, so I'd rather take the safe fingering. Or sometimes you go like, no, that is an instant coffee finger. I do want the brilliant thing. Famous example, last movement of the Haydn D Major concerto, where everybody plays the scales. The first scale maybe up the A string, and the rest in one position. Well, with Bill, no way. You'd have to play every single scale up the A string, which of course is a risk, but if you get it right, it does sound different. And those things, he was passionate about those, these real values. And therefore there is, even with the pieces that I haven't studied with him, I don't mind reading in reviews that the Pleeth school is audible in my playing, even with stuff that I didn't play for him, because of course I still hold these values up, most of them, and I still relate to them, and the sound production and the projection and the body, the posture that I have in playing is of course influenced by him, because that produces a certain sound and a certain style. So that was, I think, the most amazing thing about him. This, in a way, it's very strict in terms of achieving a musical result and holding up values, and you don't muck around with what's on the page. But then at the same time creating this real personal freedom of how your approach to it evolves. That it's not one fingering for everybody for the same passage. That was the most astonishing thing. And then seeing that difference between the one-on-one situation in his house, and then of course I took part in some of the famous master classes in Aldeburgh, for instance, in Britten Peer School. I was there 4 or 5 summers, and also to see how how differently he behaved in the public setting as sort of, he was a great actor as well, and then sort of he was a showman, no doubt about this. His stunts, playing the cello standing up, of course, that's something I've adapted, I have to admit. But seeing that difference between also being his student over years, and that there was a little bit of a show off of that as well. So the students that he had at the time, we were also a bit of it was a pack, and so he treated us a little bit different in that setting than people who just came for the masterclass. So that was part of it, and therefore what has remained with me is an enormous loyalty to the man. That's the legacy which is so 19th century and so outdated and so not relevant for today in a way, because it doesn't relate to what the profession is today. But of course there's a sentiment of having lived with someone like that for a long time, and having been given an enormous amount of wisdom in a way. And these special moments where you go like, this is really, you can't top that. I remember studying the Brahms double concerto, and he came down from upstairs and showed me Klengel's part of it with Brahms's markings in it. I mean, that's sort of, you go, right, it doesn't get better than that. But of course, in a way, all of that was in the present, but somehow very much relating to the past. And sort of that was always, also because he was old when I studied with him. I met him when he was 72 and stayed with him until he died at 83. So, 74 even when I met him. So, really very late in life. And of course that's different than studying with someone who is still doing all these things and sort of is active as a musician and is still in the career. And that's the part that I feel I missed out on a little bit. I mean, of course, I wouldn't trade it in for anything in my life. But reflecting on it, I think I missed out a little bit on the actual relevance of what I was going to become and going to do. Because of course, for him, Elgar was a contemporary. So, he was curious about it, and of course he also knew and taught and was interested in contemporary repertoire, but that ended in the 1980s. So and of course no extended techniques, no quarter tones, no all of that didn't happen in my education there, and therefore that's something that I'm now being in an education leadership position. Of course, I'm very conscious of that what I do as an artist has nothing to do with what my responsibility is to give the students today. That's something I'm very aware of, and it's, I think for even what I do as an artist doesn't even exist as a profession anymore, really. And in creating curriculum and in teaching students and in opening students' minds for what is out there in the world, that's a different story. And I think that's a challenge for anyone in music teaching, particularly these days, to be conscious of that. How relevant is what I do? And I'm very passionate about doing that, and I love what I do as a cellist, but I know that that's not necessarily what's best for every student that I meet. And reflecting on his position, that of course he was in a incredibly privileged position, and to not only have been able to accept the students who that was relevant for, because at the time I was sort of an inspiring young chamber musician soloist, and that was sort of a mirror of what he was doing. Therefore there was a perfect match, there's no doubt about that. But the world has changed, and that's 100 years ago in a way, and that's been quite, also for me, quite a journey, because of course the first couple of years teaching, you start doing that, and at some point you realize there's a gap between what I have experienced and what I do, and what most students that you deal with are doing and are aspiring to do and should be doing. So that's been quite the journey.